Hello friends, and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, hello everyone and welcome to this Sutta class. Today we are reading the Dantabhūmi Sutta, called in English The Grade of the Tamed. This is Majjhima Nikaya number 125. And this sutta is a little bit similar to the one that we read last time. Last time we read the sutta just after this one. So this time we are reading Majjhima Nikaya 125. Last time we read 126. And last time, if you remember, we had a conversation between a prince called Prince Jayasena and a monk who is otherwise unknown called the Venerable Bhumija. And so we saw that prince asking the Venerable Bhumija a question. And then after the conversation was over, Venerable Bhumija went to the Buddha to clarify whether his answers were correct. And then the Buddha gave the Venerable Bhumija a very beautiful Dhamma talk. And especially in that sutta, we met this Prince Jayasena, and we talked a little bit about this prince also. And it seems that this was somebody who was quite interested in spiritual questions, not just in Buddhist questions, but he seemed to have talked a lot to other recluses and renunciants and spiritual practitioners of all kinds of religions. But it also seemed that even though he was interested in those kind of questions, he had real trouble understanding the answers. So he didn't really have a lot of wisdom. And he also doesn't seem to have developed in the Dhamma in any way. And so this week, we are going to meet him again and again. He is talking to another monastic. And again, they're having a bit of a weird conversation because he's asking questions but doesn't really understand the answers. So in that way, those two suttas seem to be related, and that's probably also why they are put one after the other in the Majjhima Nikaya, because they're quite similar in their structure. And then again, this monastic that features in today's sutta, which is actually a novice, the novice Achiravata, also goes to the Buddha and again wants to try and figure out if there's anything he could have done differently so that the prince maybe could have understood the Dhamma. And then the Buddha also gives him a long Dhamma talk with very beautiful similes. And he talks about the entire gradual training. So this is a very interesting and very important sutta because it's very practical. It really relates to, it's really things that we can put into practice and we can apply in our Dhamma kind of life or Dhamma practice. And also it's quite a long sutta, so probably we're not going to finish today. Probably going to take a few weeks until we go through this sutta, but it doesn't matter. We have a lot of time. But for today, obviously, we're going to have a look at this conversation between the prince and this novice, and then see how far we get. And so I have put a link in the live chat to Bhante Sujata's translation, and I will be reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. So let's just start. And as usual, the sutta starts, "Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Rajagaha, in the bamboo grove, the squirrel sanctuary. Now on that occasion, the novice Achiravata was living in a forest hut. Then Prince Jayasena, while wandering and walking for exercise, went to the novice Achiravata and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side and said to the novice Achiravata, 'Master Agivesana, I have heard that a bhikkhu who abides here diligent, ardent, and resolute can achieve unification of mind.' 'That is so, Prince, that is so. A bhikkhu who abides here, diligent, ardent, and resolute, can achieve unification of mind. It would be good if Master Agivesana would teach me the Dhamma as he has heard it and mastered it. I cannot teach you the Dhamma, Prince, as I have heard it and mastered it. For if I were to teach you the Dhamma as I have heard it and mastered it, you would not understand the meaning of my words, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. So here we have a sutta, again it is set in Rajagaha, and there is a novice monk called Achiravata, and he is living alone in the forest, he is living in seclusion. So this novice Achiravata doesn't really feature in any other sutta. He seems to have been a fairly unknown monk otherwise, not one of the famous ones. And it's very likely that he was quite young, since he is still a novice. Back in the Buddha's day, unlike in modern times, back in the Buddha's day, usually people who were over the age of 20 were straight away ordained as fully ordained monastics. So the novice ordination was only done for people below the age of 20. So it is likely that this here is a teenager that is featuring in this sutta. So seems to have been a very special kind of child or teenager, because he is already very, very committed to the practice. He's already very independent. He's living alone in the forest, so he's not living with his teacher. So it seems that the teacher must have thought that this was a really very committed practitioner, so that he let him go off alone into the wilderness and practice. And obviously the only reason for going into the wilderness to practice is to be secluded from people and to really devote yourself to deep states of meditation and to develop your samadhi practice. So it seems that this was really a monastic that was very, very committed to developing the higher stages on the path, even though he seems to have been still quite young. And obviously, as in modern times, even back then, such kind of practitioners, when lay people hear about them, usually they're quite inspired. They think that's quite outstanding and quite remarkable. And they're all very interested. And like a magnet, those people attract all these crowds of people, and everybody wants to go there and see them. So once the word gets around that somebody is there practicing alone in seclusion, everybody goes there and the seclusion is destroyed. So usually people who want to practice in seclusion are very careful that other people don't really know their whereabouts. And especially in this case, because this person seems to be very young, obviously that's even more remarkable. People think it's very special that a teenager can already renounce the world and can already renounce sensual pleasures and also live alone in the wilderness, because that's difficult also to do even for adults. But obviously, if you're that young, it might be even more scary to do that or more difficult to do that. So people really want to go and see that person because they're very, very curious. And obviously, for the person who really wants to withdraw from society and practice samadhi, that is a huge disturbance and it's quite inconvenient. And so Prince Jayasena goes there anyway, because as we have talked about before, he likes to talk with different renunciants and recluses and ascetics and so on and discuss their doctrines. So anyway, he goes there, and so Achiravata is disturbed in his practice. And we also have to assume, since he is a prince, and last time we already talked about it, the commentary says he was one of the sons of King Bimbisara. King Bimbisara was the king of Magadha, so he was a very influential king, ruler of one of the two biggest countries in the Buddha's time, the country of Magadha. So probably Prince Jayasena wouldn't be walking around all alone. It's very likely that he had a lot of friends and servants and helpers and people around him, maybe even his wives and his children, and like a big crowd of people. He wouldn't just go there alone. And probably he was there with his carriages or his horses and elephants, and it was probably a very big, noisy outing, and a huge crowd of people that were coming to this novice Achiravata. And so once he is there, he initiates the conversation by asking a question, again, something he has heard from other practitioners. And he heard that somebody who practices very diligently can achieve unification of mind. So obviously that is a synonym for deep samadhi practice or for one of the jhana states. So he's asking about developing samadhi. And of course, the novice Achiravata confirms that it is possible that when you practice very diligently, that you can achieve deep stages of samadhi. And then the Prince Jayasena wants to hear some more about this. He wants to kind of hear more Dhamma talk or more Dhamma teachings about this question, how to actually achieve this kind of samadhi. But the novice isn't really comfortable teaching him. So, and he says, well, it would be really difficult for you to understand if I taught you. And then obviously I feel very uncomfortable if you didn't understand. So obviously for the teacher, it's not really comfortable if the student doesn't understand, because then either the student says, well, it's a bad teacher, or the teacher will feel bad because he can't teach properly, or the student will start to argue with the teacher, or the student will start to criticize the teacher, or rumors will spread about the teacher that it's not, the teacher himself hasn't understood properly. And especially if the student here in this case is a very, very influential person, obviously it can become quite uncomfortable. And especially in this case, because the novice is so young, it can be quite difficult. Also because maybe he feels shy to teach such a high-ranking person, or he feels he's not qualified because after all, he's still a novice. He probably hasn't practiced the Dhamma for too long. Probably he doesn't have much experience as a teacher. And so he isn't really comfortable trying to teach the Prince Jayasena. And as I also mentioned, Prince Jayasena has a reputation for discussing a lot with other recluses, but not really understanding what they're teaching him. So it can be quite difficult. And I feel probably a lot of people who have tried teaching the Dhamma might identify a little bit with this novice, because sometimes it can be very challenging to teach Dhamma. And there are a lot of people out there whose character is just such that maybe they're a little bit shy, maybe they're a little bit introverted, maybe they really feel that they're not qualified to teach yet, maybe they feel that they're too young, too recently ordained, or anything. There can be a lot of reasons why people, even though they have a good practice, don't feel comfortable acting as a teacher. And so I feel like this is one of the rare instances in the suttas where somebody says, like, I really feel like I'm not qualified to teach you, so please just leave me alone. But I feel like it's very, very relatable. And as I mentioned, it's not really connected with having good or bad practice. Obviously, this is a young person who has very good practice. They have gone into the forest alone. They really want to practice samadhi. They are very committed. Still, they are not in a position to teach. But obviously, the prince, being the prince and being an influential person and usually getting his way, he is not deterred, and he keeps on insisting, and he really, really wants to get a Dhamma talk from this person, from the novice. So the prince continues pressuring him, and the prince says, "Let Master Agivesana teach me the Dhamma as he has heard it and mastered it. Perhaps I can understand the meaning of his words." And so finally, the novice relents, because he can't get rid of the prince otherwise. And because obviously the prince, you can't really piss off the prince, because his father is a very influential king. So the novice then says, "I shall teach you the Dhamma, Prince, as I have heard it and mastered it. If you can understand the meaning of my words, that will be good. But if you cannot understand the meaning, then leave it at that and do not question me about it further." So the novice now sets a condition, and he says, well, if you can understand, that's great. If you cannot understand it, then please let's not have an endless debate and discussion about it, because if you can't understand it, well, there's nothing I can do. Because he feels like he's not really that qualified as a teacher. And also because he really wants to practice in seclusion, obviously having endless debates about it is going to destroy his peace of mind even more. So random chit-chat and endless debates is actually one of the most disturbing things for samadhi practice. It's more disturbing than other noises of nature or than even music or anything, because you get all these words in your head and you get all these new ideas in your head. And especially if you have a debate, emotions can get quite heated. And obviously if emotions get stirred up, that is also very, very detrimental for samadhi practice. So he's really just trying to protect his practice here. And so he relents and he's willing to teach, but he's not willing to have a lengthy debate. And so that is the condition that the novice sets here now. And the prince then says, let Master Agivesana teach me the Dhamma as he has heard it and mastered it. If I can understand the meaning of his words, that will be good. If I cannot understand the meaning, then I will leave it at that, and I will not question him about it further. So the prince agrees to the condition. Then the novice Achiravata taught Prince Jayasena the Dhamma as he has heard it and mastered it. After he had spoken, Prince Jayasena remarked, it is impossible, Master Agivesana, it cannot happen, that a bhikkhu who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute can achieve unification of mind. Then, having declared to the novice Achiravata that this was impossible and could not happen, Prince Jayasena rose from his seat and departed. So the novice did give him a Dhamma talk about how to achieve unification of mind, how to achieve deep samadhi states. So obviously, the novice did have some knowledge about this because this was exactly the way he was practicing. He was staying in the forest, trying to develop deep samadhi. He was very diligent, ardent, and resolute. So he did have some knowledge about this. It's very likely that he taught the prince in the proper way. But still, the prince obviously didn't understand, as we already expected. And the prince just said, well, this is entirely impossible. And he is dissatisfied and he just gets up and leaves. So the outcome of his teaching wasn't very favorable. And then soon after Prince Jayasena had left, the novice Achiravata went to the Blessed One. After paying homage to the Blessed One, he sat down at one side and reported to the Blessed One his entire conversation with Prince Jayasena. When he had finished, the Blessed One said to him, so now we see what happens. The novice doesn't continue practicing in seclusion in his forest hut. The novice now goes to see the Buddha and checks with the Buddha and tells him what has happened. So maybe the novice felt that he failed as a teacher. Maybe his samadhi was already destroyed and because of the visit, and he kept on thinking about whether he had done anything wrong, and he wanted to see the Buddha and check if he did something wrong. Or maybe he just thought, well, there's this influential prince and he was quite upset with the way I taught him, and he declared that the Dhamma is impossible and it's impossible to do these kind of practices and to develop deep samadhi. So since this is a very influential person, this might have repercussions for the entire Sangha. This might influence us badly. This might influence his father, the king, King Bimbisara, who was a main supporter of the Sangha. This might have implications for the Buddha or for all the other monastics if this very influential person is now dissatisfied with us. So I better go and tell the Buddha and check if I did something wrong or if there's anything that needs to be done. So obviously, his practice was interrupted. He had to leave his forest hut and he wanted to go and check with the Buddha and report what had happened. And so, but then the Buddha obviously is able to sort of put him at ease, and the Buddha says to him, Agivesana, how is it possible that Prince Jayasena, living in the midst of sensual pleasures, enjoying sensual pleasures, being devoured by thoughts of sensual pleasures, being consumed by the fever of sensual pleasures, bent on the search for sensual pleasures, could know, see, or realize that which must be known through renunciation, seen through renunciation, attained through renunciation, realized through renunciation? That is impossible. So the Buddha puts the novice at ease. The Buddha says, well, you didn't do anything wrong. Obviously, the prince was impossible to understand. It was impossible for the prince to understand what you were teaching him, even though your teaching was correct, because the prince is just so enmeshed in all these sensual pleasures that he cannot understand how you practice deep samadhi, because deep samadhi obviously is the exact opposite of sensual pleasures. And so if your mind is just inclined towards those sense pleasures, then obviously the mind isn't able to really understand the path of practice properly, where you have to renounce all these things. So obviously when you practice deep samadhi, that means the jhana states, that means you overcome the entire sense realm, all the attachments that you have to any kind of sensual objects, the sensual pleasures, but also all the unpleasurable things, all the dukkha that you experience with the body, all the attachment that you have to the body or anything around us. We have to let all this go, at least temporarily, in order to enter a jhana. So jhana states are obviously in the fine material realm. We have to overcome the sensual realm entirely in order to enter a jhana. And obviously, if your mind isn't even inclined to entertain the possibility that this is theoretically possible, how would there ever be any kind of understanding of the way of practice in order to attain such a state? So there's nothing that the novice Achiravata could have done to make the prince understand. Nobody could have made the prince understand. And then the Buddha illustrates his point with a few similes. And the first is the simile of the tameable animals. And the Buddha says, suppose Agivesana, there were 2 tameable elephants, horses or oxen, that were well tamed and well disciplined, and 2 tameable elephants, horses or oxen, that were untamed and undisciplined. What do you think, Agivesana? Would the 2 tameable elephants, horses or oxen, that were well tamed and well disciplined, being tamed, acquire the behavior of the tamed? Would they arrive at the grade of the tamed? Yes, Venerable Sir. But would the 2 tameable elephants, horses or oxen, that were untamed and undisciplined, being untamed, acquire the behavior of the tamed? Would they arrive at the grade of the tamed, like the 2 tameable elephants, or horses or oxen, that were well tamed and well disciplined? No, Venerable Sir. So too, Agivesana, it is impossible that Prince Jayasena, living in the midst of sensual pleasures, and so on, being consumed by all these sensual pleasures, could know, see, or realize that which must be known through renunciation, seen through renunciation, attained through renunciation, realized through renunciation. So there is here a simile about those tameable animals. Maybe the simile was a little bit complicated. So what the Buddha says here, suppose there were 2 sets of animals, horses or elephants or oxen, doesn't matter which kind of animals, animals that can be tamed and then can be utilized by humans for some kind of work. And there were 2 sets. One of those is actually tamed. So both sets of these animals are theoretically tameable, but only one of them is actually tamed and the other set is theoretically tameable, but is actually still wild. And so obviously the one that has already been tamed now has acquired the behavior of tamed animals, and humans can use them for the kind of work that those animals could be used. While the other set of animals, even though they're theoretically tameable, they haven't been trained, their behavior is still very wild, and they won't just suddenly out of nowhere have that behavior and will become usable by those humans. And so the same with human beings. All human beings can theoretically walk the Buddhist path. They can all theoretically train their mind, tame their mind, let go of the defilements, engage in Buddhist practices, and theoretically attain deep samadhi. But only the people who actually tame themselves and actually train in the proper way over a long period of time will eventually attain that state where the mind becomes so peaceful and calm that it can enter into deep samadhi. And the other kind of persons, while they theoretically could attain deep samadhi, since they don't undertake the training, their mind just remains wild, and the defilements just run wild in their minds. So they won't just miraculously attain samadhi because they haven't undergone all the training and they haven't tamed themselves. So just as those animals won't just spontaneously become tamed, the human mind also will not spontaneously become tamed if you don't go through all the Buddhist training. And so since Prince Jayasena has no interest in actually walking the path, it's not possible for him to suddenly enter into samadhi or even understand what samadhi is all about and how the path works. So that was the first simile that the Buddha talked about here. The second simile is the simile of the mountain. And there the Buddha says the following: suppose Agivesana, there were a high mountain not far from a village or town, and two friends would leave the village or town and approach the mountain hand in hand. Having reached it, one friend would remain below at the foot of the mountain, while the other would climb to the top. Then the friend who remained below at the foot of the mountain would say to the friend who stood on the top, "Well, friend, what do you see? Standing on top of the mountain." And the other replied, "Standing on top of the mountain, friend, I see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds." Then the first friend would say, "It is impossible, friend, it cannot happen, that while standing on top of the mountain, you should see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds." Then the other friend would come down to the foot of the mountain, take his friend by the arm, and make him climb to the top of the mountain. After giving him a few moments to catch his breath, he would ask, "Well, friend, standing on top of the mountain, what do you see?" And his friend would reply, "Standing on top of the mountain, friend, I see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds." Then the other would say, "Friend, just a little earlier we heard you say, it is impossible, friend, it cannot happen, that while standing on top of the mountain, you should see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds. But just now we heard you say, standing on top of the mountain, friend, I see lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely ponds." Then the first friend would reply, "Because I was obstructed by this high mountain, friend, I did not see what was there to be seen." So to Agivesana, Prince Jayasena is obstructed, hindered, blocked, and enveloped by a still greater mass than this, the mass of ignorance. Thus, it is impossible that Prince Jayasena, living in the midst of sensual pleasures and so on, being entirely enmeshed in sensual pleasures, could know, see, or realize that which must be known through renunciation, seen through renunciation, attained through renunciation, and realized through renunciation. So here we have another simile, the simile of the mountain. So in this case, again, there are two friends, and the two friends walk around in the countryside and they come to a high mountain. And one friend climbs to the top of the mountain and the other friend is too lazy and they just remain below at the foot of the mountain. And so the friend who is at the top of the mountain obviously has a vast view of the entire surroundings and he sees very far and he can see all the landscape around him, all the whatever groves and meadows and ponds and parks and so on. It's a very beautiful view. And obviously the one at the foot of the mountain can't see any of this. And since he can't see any of this, he doesn't believe that it is actually there. And then the first friend drags the other one up the mountain. And once the other friend is up the mountain, obviously they can also see all of this because it's just plain there and plain obvious once you're at the top of the mountain. And so his previous disbelief is now replaced with actual proper seeing. And so obviously that mountain is a simile for ignorance, as the Buddha says. If you don't actually walk the path, if you don't actually go into deep samadhi, if you don't actually develop the wisdom, then all the ignorance and all the defilements in your mind will block you from seeing reality as it actually is. So you might not even believe that it is possible to walk this path. You might not even believe that jhana states exist or that liberation exists. But once you have actually made the effort of walking the path, then you will see for yourself, and then all this mass of ignorance will be dissolved. So one thing the simile also tells us is that the path takes effort. It's like, but people are usually lazy. If they don't have the motivation to practice, they won't practice. It's like the friend who stays at the bottom of the mountain, because there's a high mountain and it can feel like quite overwhelming to practice. Sometimes we feel like there are so many defilements in our mind, there's no way we are ever going to make any progress on the path, or there's no way we can ever abandon them all and let them all go and become liberated. But it's like climbing a mountain step by step. If you just put one foot after the other and just don't give up climbing, eventually you have to come to the top of the mountain. So eventually you will have abandoned all these defilements. But it does take effort and it does take commitment. And it really does take going against the grain, going against our usual habits, going against our defilements, because our defilements will just tell us to be lazy and to chill out at the bottom of the mountain where all the defilements are, instead of making the effort and actually practicing. But obviously, once we're at the top of the mountain, once we have actually practiced, once we've actually attained samadhi, and once we have developed some wisdom, obviously there will not be any doubt anymore, because we can see for ourselves that those states are actually possible and that humans or beings in general can attain them. But obviously, if you're too lazy, we will never just spontaneously see them, just as a person who stays at the bottom of the mountain will not spontaneously fly up to the top. And so in the same way, obviously, it's impossible for somebody like Prince Jayasena, who likes to talk a lot and who thinks that they're quite a spiritual person, but doesn't actually practice in any way. It's impossible for such a person to actually understand jhana states and to actually understand those higher stages on the path. And then the Buddha says, Akivesana, if these two similes had occurred to you with reference to Prince Jayasena, he would have spontaneously acquired confidence in you, and being confident, he would have shown his confidence to you. Venerable Sir, how could these two similes have occurred to me with reference to Prince Jayasena, as they occur to the Blessed One, since they are spontaneous and have never been heard before? So the Buddha says, if you had thought of those two similes and if you had taught those similes to the prince, maybe he would have understood why he doesn't really properly understand how samadhi works. And maybe he would have attained confidence in the Dhamma, and maybe he would have been settled in the Dhamma and have been able to actually make progress in the Dhamma. But the novice says, well, how could I have thought of these similes, or how could I have remembered these similes? You hadn't even taught them yet. You just came up with them just now. So I had no opportunity to hear them before, and so I couldn't have taught them to someone else. And these similes, even though they're quite beautiful, they're actually quite rare. I think this is possibly the only occurrence of them in the suttas, so they are actually quite special, even though they are really, really beautiful and I think very, very easy to understand. So I think the novice has a point telling the Buddha, well, you haven't really taught them anywhere else before in any other sutta. And then now the Buddha decides to teach the novice Achiravata a little bit more. And so now the Buddha launches into a very long simile. And then after he goes through this very long simile, he starts teaching about the gradual training. So I think for today, we would just read through this very long simile, and then we will probably finish reading the sutta for today, because there's no point starting with the gradual training for today. I think we should leave that for next time then. But let's go through this simile now. This is the simile of how you train an elephant, how you capture a wild elephant in the forest and then train it until it becomes fit for service service for the king, so becoming a king's elephant. And all the various stages and various trainings that a wild elephant has to go through until it is fully trained and can be employed in the service of the king. So the Buddha says, suppose Agivesana, a head-anointed noble king, addresses his elephant woodsman thus. Good elephant woodsman, Mount the king's elephant, enter the elephant wood, and when you see a forest elephant, bind him by the neck to the king's elephant." Having replied, "Yes, sire," the elephant woodsman mounts the king's elephant, enters the elephant wood, and when he sees a forest elephant, binds him by the neck to the king's elephant. The king's elephant leads him out into the open. It is in this way that a forest elephant comes out into the open, for the forest elephant clings to the elephant wood. So here the simile of training an elephant begins with capturing a wild elephant. So there is a wild elephant just roaming around freely in the forest, but the king wants to have a new elephant, so he sends the elephant trainer into the forest to capture a fresh, new forest elephant and then train him. So obviously the forest elephant isn't voluntarily going to come out because the forest elephant is attached to the forest. And so you need an elephant that is actually already trained, and so that you can bind the forest elephant to that already trained elephant, here called the king's elephant. So obviously an elephant is very strong and also very, very stubborn. So humans are by far not strong enough to drag that elephant out of the wood, but another elephant might. So you need to capture that forest elephant, then tie it to the already trained elephant, the king's elephant, and then the king's elephant can drag the other elephant out of the wood, and then that forest elephant, for the first time in his life, probably comes out into the open. So we already can maybe see a little bit where the simile is going. It's like somebody who is roaming around in all the delusions and the defilements, and their mind has been enmeshed for their entire life in various delusions and defilements, and they cling to all these ideas and defilements, and they wouldn't voluntarily come out of those defilements. So there needs to be somebody who shows the way, somebody who can guide them and lead them out of their delusions, out into the open. So to a space where they can breathe a little bit freely and see that there's something other than just blindly following the defilements, so that there is a Dhamma path, a path to liberation, a path out of this suffering and out of this mess. And obviously, what is here the king's elephant will later be the Buddha or an arahant or a teacher who can guide a new person and show them another way. But we will see that later. And so now the first elephant has now been brought out into the open. And then the elephant woodsman informs the head anointed noble king, "Sire, the forest elephant has come out into the open." The king addresses his elephant tamer thus: "Come, good elephant tamer, tame the forest elephant. Subdue his forest habits, subdue his forest memories and intentions, subdue his distress, fatigue, and fever over leaving the forest. Get him to take delight in the town, inculcate in him habits congenial to human beings." Having replied, "Yes, sire," the elephant tamer plants a large post in the earth and binds the forest elephant to it by the neck in order to subdue his forest habits and so on, and to inculcate in him habits congenial to human beings. So we see the next step, once the forest elephant has been dragged out of the forest into the open, is to plant a strong post there and tie the elephant to it so that the elephant doesn't run off back into the forest. Again, there needs to be something that keeps us on the path of training. Usually this will be the training rules. For lay people, this would be the 5 silas. For monastics, this would usually be the Patimokkha rules, the Vinaya rules, so the rules of monastic training, monastic conduct. And of course, having just come out of the forest, that elephant still has a lot of habits from forest life. They still have a lot of memories, a lot of intentions, all their thoughts still all turn around and around all these forest things that he is attached to. In the same way, when you have just started to embark on the path of Dhamma, our minds still incline very much to sensual pleasures, and we think still a lot about sensual pleasures. And when people have just gone forth into monastic lives, we see that they still have a lot of habits of lay people, for example. And so part of the monastic training also is to kind of change the mindset, and so that the new monastics kind of take delight in monastic life and sort of develop new habits that are more in line with Dhamma practice. In the same way, this elephant here is tied to this pole and then being trained in new habits and new intentions and new memories of living together with human beings. And then the text continues, then the elephant tamer addresses the elephant with words that are gentle, pleasing to the ear, and lovable, as go to the heart, are courteous, desired by many, and agreeable to many. When the first elephant is addressed by such words, he listens, gives the ear, and exerts his mind to understand. The elephant tamer next rewards him with grass fodder and water. When the first elephant accepts the grass fodder and water from him, the elephant tamer knows, now the king's elephant will live. So the way that they train this elephant is not with violence. They train it with kind words. They treat it well. And they are very gentle with him, so that the elephant isn't afraid of the tamer, and the elephant understands that they're not going to harm him, and that the elephant can relax. And eventually he will take food and drink there. And so obviously at that point, they don't have to worry about the elephant just dying and not being willing to train. So they're not training the elephant with violence, they're actually training the elephant with kindness. And again, obviously, this is how we should also practice the Dhamma, and how we should interact with our fellow practitioners, fellow human beings, or fellow beings in general. Because if we are kind to each other, the likelihood is much greater that other people will kind of try to understand the Dhamma and will kind of try to start practicing themselves. And so the elephant tamer is also taking care of all the material needs of that elephant, giving him good food and drink and whatever the elephant needs. So in the same way, monastic teachers need to sort of look after all the needs, also the material needs of younger members of the community, people who have just recently embarked on the path, whether that is lay people or other monastics. We need to make sure that they are okay, that they don't feel unsafe, that they don't feel threatened, that they're not just there because they're afraid of violence or something. We need to make sure that they're calm and comfortable, because that is the environment where Dhamma practice can flourish. And then once people have relaxed, and once they're willing to actually train, and once they have taken an interest in the training, then the simile continues, and the Buddha says, then the elephant tamer trains him further thus. Take up, put down. When the king's elephant obeys his tamer's orders to take up and put down, and carries out his instructions, the elephant tamer trains him further thus. Go forward, go back. When the king's elephant obeys his tamer's orders to go forward and go back, and carries out his instructions, the elephant tamer trains him further thus. Get up, sit down. When the king's elephant obeys his tamer's orders to get up and sit down, and carries out his instructions, the elephant tamer trains him further in the task called imperturbability. He ties a giant plank to his trunk. A man with a lance in his hand sits on his neck. Men with lances in their hands surround him on all sides, and the elephant tamer himself stands in front of him, holding a long lance pole. When the elephant is being trained in the task of imperturbability, he does not move his forelegs or his hind legs, does not move his forequarters or his hindquarters, he does not move his head, ears, tusk, tail, or trunk. The king's elephant is able to endure blows from spears, blows from swords, blows from arrows, blows from other beings, and the thundering sound of drums, kettle drums, trumpets, and tom-toms. Being rid of all faults and defects, purged of flaws, he is worthy of the king, in the king's service, considered one of the factors of a king. So now the training continues, and it gets a lot more specific. So they train the elephant to carry out various tasks, getting up, sitting down, taking up stuff, carrying stuff around, walking forwards and backwards, and so on. So they're starting to really tame that elephant to obey various orders so that it becomes really useful to the service of human beings. And once it has learned all that, then there is sort of the highest form of training where the elephant is trained for battle and where the elephant is trained in a task called imperturbability. So that in battle, it doesn't panic, so it remains calm and it can withstand various kinds of attacks and a lot of noise and all the, dangers that are around him. And if the elephant remains imperturbable, even in that situation, so imperturbable to the highest degree, then it becomes fit for the king's service, and it has been fully trained. It has trained to the end and is now considered worthy of the king. And so obviously, as I already mentioned, this is a simile for the gradual training. So once that, as we have seen in the step before, the elephant, with kind words and by looking after all the material needs of that elephant, the elephant was prepared for this kind of training. The elephant became willing to listen to that trainer and to follow the instructions. And as I mentioned, obviously this is a simile for making progress on the Buddhist path. So after making sure that people who are willing to train are comfortable and feeling safe and are willing to listen to the Dhamma, then there are various practices building up one after the other. This is called the gradual training, and obviously we will go through the gradual training in a lot of detail as we read through this sutta. And in the same way that they train this elephant in various tasks, picking up and walking around and sitting down and stuff, so there are different steps in the gradual training that monastics or people who want to develop the higher stages on the path need to go through one by one. And then eventually there is the final task, which is called imperturbability. And of course, we use the term imperturbability also in suttas, in other suttas. In Pali, this is called Anenja. And there's, of course, one famous sutta called the Anenja Sapaya Sutta, which just talks about how to attain this imperturbability. And this is usually considered stages of mental development from the fourth jhana upwards. So the fourth jhana and all the immaterial attainments. So these are very, very high developments on the path, high stages on the path, where the mind is entirely balanced and entirely equanimous, and nothing from the outside can impinge on that mind or destroy the inner peace. And so with the simile of here, the elephant being attacked by all kinds of swords and by very loud noises and so on, still remaining imperturbable, in the same way, a meditator in those high stages from the fourth jhana upwards would not be disturbed by any outside noises or by any kind of outside dangers. So this, of course, is then the highest development on the path. And once you're there, it's only a very tiny step to full enlightenment. And then, of course, as the elephant is then fully trained and worthy for the service of the king, a meditator in that state would be very close to arahantship, and also at that point, once they attain arahantship, have finished the training and be fully enlightened. So this was kind of the simile of the gradual training in brief. And for today, I think we're going to stop here. And then next time we will start talking about the gradual training in a lot more detail than what I've talked about just now. So I think at this point, we're going to stop for today with the Dantabhūmi Sutta. And now if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the chat and I will see if I can answer them. So let's see if there's any question. So far, I see a lot of people checking in. Hello, everyone. Nice to see so many people are there. So there's one question by Anonymous. And so the question is, what if someone has heard the Dhamma but is scared to lose their self, scared of change, so they don't practice? How can you help them, or just leave them be until they are ready? Where sometimes it's a little bit difficult to know if you just should leave them be or if you can help them. So it's always good to engage a little bit in conversation, see if they're open to an exchange. Obviously, if they shut you down entirely and they're unwilling to engage with you, then obviously there's nothing much you can do, because you can't really force people to want to practice the Dhamma. And as we have seen here in this sutta, the best thing is to talk to people with kind words, make sure that they're comfortable, make sure that they have everything they need, also materially and so on. So if people are just really very scared about their survival or anything, they're not really open to practicing the Dhamma. So making sure that people are comfortable and that they don't fear any kind of violence from fellow practitioners or from teachers is a prerequisite for actually talking about Dhamma. And we also see that in other suttas all the time, that when the Buddha meets monastics, the first thing he will ask is, are you comfortable? Do you get enough food? And so on. And only after that will he talk about Dhamma with people, because you need to make sure that they're in the right mind space to actually be able to talk about Dhamma with you. So in this case, it seems the person is scared. So it's maybe good to address that first, make sure that they're comfortable, make sure that they're not afraid before actually starting to talk about deeper Dhamma. But then, of course, one of the core teachings of Buddhism is the teaching of anatta, of non-self. So it's quite common for people to experience some kind of fear because we are attached to this idea of a self. Obviously, if we were not attached to the idea of a self, we would already be enlightened. So we wouldn't have been reborn. We would already be arahants. We wouldn't need to practice. So fear is quite common. And in that case, sometimes it can be better to talk about other aspects of the path. If people have a lot of fear to lose their self, they're obviously not ready to really engage with the teachings of anatta. It might be better to start with earlier stages on the gradual training, or it might be better to start with other kinds of practices. Metta practice, for example, can be really, really powerful. People who are very scared, if they practice metta, it can happen that their heart opens, that the fear gradually disappears, because they practice this kindness towards themselves and towards others. So obviously, kindness and fear cannot coexist at the same time in the mind, because they're sort of opposites. So as your metta practice becomes stronger, fear sort of starts to diminish. So trying to go at the roundabout way, not like kind of beating the person with anatta over the head if they're already scared of non-self, but like trying to take a gentle kind of detour and coming from the side at the problem and starting to do other practices first. Maybe reading suttas, maybe doing metta practice. Maybe just, going to the monastery, having a good time there, meeting other practitioners, having good experiences can already help to really reduce the fear. And to see that, people who are also practicing, they haven't turned into soulless robots. They haven't turned into crazy psychopaths just because they are practicing anatta, and maybe they have already realized anatta. Maybe they are already noble-born stream enterers or arahants or something, but they haven't become crazy psychopaths, but they have actually become really good people, really kind people. That can also help a lot with the fear, because you see that you're not going to turn into a monster if you do this kind of practice. And then there's another question from Dan. And Dan says, Aya, do you think it's advisable or okay in the first instance before visiting a monastery to ask if you can ordain and what position the Sangha would likely take on an issue and protocols? So I think obviously it's always okay to ask questions, whatever questions there are. And it's not uncommon that people contact monastics and ask about ordination. However, it's also very, very unlikely that a community would make any kind of commitment to you if they don't know you. So if you have never visited, they would very likely not tell you, yeah, just come and we'll ordain you. So very likely they would tell you to come and visit in person, and then to get to meet each other. And then if you get along, like see how you get along, see how you fit into the community. And only at that point would they kind of make any kind of further commitment to talk about ordination with you. So maybe they would explain to you the general process in the monastery, how ordinations usually take place, but that doesn't mean that they make a specific commitment to you. So, for example, if people ask me about ordination, I usually explain it's a long process. There are different stages that you go through. Usually you spend time at a monastery, and then you take what we call anagarika ordination, or like a postulant ordination, or postulant like stage is not really a proper ordination, where you spend a certain amount of time in a monastery as preparation for novice ordination. And then eventually, after, let's say, a year or whatever time, you become a novice, and then you spend again a certain amount of time, sometimes several years, as a novice before you can take full ordination. So it's quite a long process, and it's quite different from place to place. It can also be very different from men and for women. It can also be very different if you go to Asia or if you stay in the West. Especially for men in Asia, it can be quite easy to find places where you ordain, but then they won't give you any training. So it also depends very much on what you're interested in and what you are looking for. If you just want the ordination, or if you want actually a community where you can live and where you can train and where you can practice the path. So like you have to fit into the community, and the community has to think that you're a good fit for them. So it really needs, like, there is a lot of like there's a personal component also, like you have to really meet them and spend time with them and so on. So you can always ask beforehand, and you can always like contact monasteries with any kind of question, really. But it doesn't really replace the personal, like the personal visits and the personal contact. And you were asking about protocols. So yeah, well, usually people just send an email and try to be really, like, send a polite email and show that you like really care. Like if your email doesn't have a proper format of address, and you don't sign your name, and the email is like full of spelling mistakes, obviously people will think that you don't really care about the answer, because you haven't spent 5 minutes like typing a proper email. So then people will also not take a lot of care sending you a proper email or a proper reply back. But if you show that like you're polite and that you really kind of care about the question that you send, then obviously people will usually take the time to give you a proper reply. So the protocol is just to be friendly and polite, I think. So I don't see any further questions, and we've also been going for almost 1 hour. So I hope you enjoyed the sutta, the Dantabhūmi Sutta that we read today, and obviously we will continue next time. And then we will finish for today with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I wish you a good rest of the day and a good week, and I will see you all next Tuesday.